Thank you so much. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Allison. I'll be speaking in English for most of today. My name is Laura Cauer Garcia, and I'm the program manager for Civic Space at INCLO, and my pronouns are she and her. Before I get us started, just some very simple logistics notes to say that, as you saw, we are recording the event to be able to share it afterwards. Anyone that missed the event, we'll put it on our INCLO's YouTube channel. For that reason, if you have any questions that you're going to want to share with us, but you have any security concerns that you don't want your name to be displayed, please let us know in the chat or when you're putting the question, and we'll make sure to take care of that. But we want to hear your questions. We have some time for questions at the end, and for that, we'll ask you to use the Q&A box at the bottom. You'll see it at the bottom on the options, along with interpretation and kind of the other options that you have there. I'm just going to think we were having just a speaker versus a gallery option. So just to get us started, for those of you that might not be as familiar, INCLO, the International Network of Civil Liberties Organizations, is a network of 15 national human rights and civil liberties organizations from around the world that come together to support each other, to learn from each other, and to collaborate on issues that they agree are international in relevance, and that is one of the reasons we are here today. The project that led to this collection of articles that we have titled In Our Hands, Communities Rooting Out Discriminatory Policing began 2 years ago, or even further, when our network came together to try to figure out how and if we could respond to the inspiring social movements and protests that arose after the murder of George Floyd, one of the many lives around the world that have been cut short by violent and discriminatory policing. And we had a lot of questions for each other. We were asking, how do demands to defund or detask police resonate in other parts of the world? Who are the communities that are being disproportionately affected by traditional sort of understandings of public order or safety, and what are the solutions that they want to propose? And then, are there global lessons that we can learn from grassroots social movements that we can kind of that are global in scope? And I think the last one, and maybe one of the more important ones, what is our role, as NGOs, as we reckon kind of with failures of more than of decades of gradual police reform, And so this definitely called for a different approach than our previous reports, where we could come up perhaps with expert findings and some pretty homogeneous conclusions. This was more of a listening and internal and external learning exercise. And so the way this worked was our members partnered with local activists, community organizations to write an article together, and through that explore sort of the intersections and disconnects between safety, police, police and community-based solutions to social issues. So as a result, and we're really excited to share this, in Our Hands website, you can now read articles from Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. And shortly, they'll be joined by articles from Ireland, Indonesia, and from Argentina. They're very, very diverse. They show experiences from communities that not only due to race, but also ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic circumstances have been confronted with police and state violence quite disproportionately. And then the other aspect of this project is, since believing in the power of creativity and art, when we're exploring these heavy, difficult projects, we partnered with the feminist platform Feminietas to commission illustrations for each of these articles. And they are fabulous and thought-provoking and inspiring, and I hope you get to enjoy them as well. So our hope really for In Our Hands is for it to be an offering, an invitation to think further about these issues, and reimagine a world where safety and care does not automatically mean calling in law enforcement and or having a security response. You're going to hear more from 4 panelists today, so 4 distinct experiences, national contexts. But before I turn to them, I wanted to share with you some of the reflections that came up in my dialogue that I had with the compendium co-editors, Emmanuel Andrews and Cheryl Duss, and that will be my closing. So this might not come as a surprise, but we have not learned from decades of failure of police reform. That's evident in the number of deaths from police shootings and the victims of police brutality who come from marginalized communities. There is a lack of will and imagination from governments to think about solutions that don't require police intervention. That seems to be the easiest, the fallback. And then when policing is applied to non-security issues, to social issues, the consequences are severe human rights violations. Because police responses that resort to force tend to create further exclusion and violence, both in the short term and long term. They are not trained to address and solve issues of drug abuse, sex worker disputes, housing problems, land conflicts, etc. No? There's of course a lot more that can be said of what is wrong or challenging, but what we want to focus on today is all that has been done and continues to be done to protect community members and to create societies where all have the opportunity to thrive. And so for that, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, Nayara Kali, for her opening reflections. My quick intro for her is, so Nayara Kali Silva Sanfo is an Afro-Brazilian woman of Ivorian descent living in Sao Paulo, Brazil. She is currently the coordinator of the United Nations Anti-Racism Coalition, UNARC. She's engaged in academic research on migration rights and social justice activism through the intersectionalities of gender and race in South America. Her professional journey is focused on education, policymaking through a decolonial approach, and international human rights institutions. And we are very excited to have her join us today. So Nayara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Linclo. And good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity a lot to be part of this important session on the urgent need to stop police brutality and discrimination worldwide. As Laura said, my name is Nayara Kali Silva Sanfo. I am the coordinator of UNARC, the United Nations Anti-Racism Coalition, and we are an international coalition for UN accountability on violence against Africans and people of African descent in the context of law enforcement. I'm very glad to highlight that CELS and ACLU are members and active members of the coalition. The organizations that compose UNARC, which now add to more than 100 organizations, were responsible for the international advocacy that pushed the United Nations to create a new mechanism, which is EMLR, the UN Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the Context of Law Enforcement. So this is EMLR. This particular advocacy effort started in 2020 after George Floyd's death, when a group of 690 organizations signed a letter within 48 hours requesting emergency action from the UN concerning the continued genocide against Black people internationally. So also today, I want to highlight that while we are speaking, ACLU, UNARC, the International Service for Human Rights, and Princeton University are organizing an important side event during the Human Rights Council in Geneva, talking about EMLR's visit to the US and racial injustice in the country. So UNARC values centering directly impacted people, their families, and their communities. Also, we address the root causes of police discrimination against Africans and people of African descent, which are colonialism and the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. Both of these spheres, meaning giving a platform to directly impacted people and also addressing root causes, are key when we talk about discriminatory policing. Once the affected communities are often invisibilized, silenced, and have their struggles minimized by their states. And even though I will focus my intervention on systemic racism against people of African descent globally, many other communities are affected, right? So this is observed in law enforcement violence against Black people, against women, LGBTQ plus persons, indigenous peoples, sex workers, migrants, Quilombola communities, Maroon societies, African matrix religions, and other so-called minorities. Also, in these times when ultra-right-wing governments get stronger and the conservative narrative increases, it is essential to ask ourselves how we can root out discriminatory policing, how to find safe spaces for our communities, how to engage with other human rights defenders, how to reimagine security and safety from our own perspective, and also how to protect and maintain our mental health, working on such heartbreak and violence that most times are directly connected with our own identities, right? So when we talk about building these decolonial or post-colonial approaches, we need to first abandon the colonialism idea of universality and embrace the comprehension that resistance goes beyond damage control. So the impacted communities have an essential role of acting according to their own perception and realities. Therefore, each response to all of these questions should be organically formed by the affected communities with their ancestral technologies, with their backgrounds and expertise. I also reinforce and underline how crucial it is to have international institutions such as the UN working in collaboration with advocates and directly impacted people on the ground to have their work and visibility amplified on the national level, and also to push the governments to make a real change. Likewise, international institutions need civil society and human rights advocates to provide them with data, the reality, and the real expertise about what is happening on the ground. UNARC, we understand that systemic racism work in circular ways due to systemic racism. African and people of African descent lack the resources and access needed to combat systemic racism nationally and regionally. So collaboration on the international level is key to interrupting this vicious cycle. Last year, we organized a side event during the 52nd Human Rights Council session called Beyond Policing, where advocates from Maroon societies, Quilombola communities in Brazil discussed safety and security from a Black freedom perspective. And I would like to comment a few highlights from these activists who gave their testimonies. So first, there are many, many ways to envision a society where Black people are not oppressed by the police. It can be through abolitionism, it can be through reform. There is not a unique way of doing it. And again, each community should be able to reflect on its own scenario and purpose. Second, the militarism of the police is a crucial problem in Latin America and the Caribbean governments, which is increased by racial profiling. So many communities ask for complete disengagement between police and military forces, and also appropriate training for law enforcement agents on racial profiling. The third aspect is about migrants of African descent and Africans that have been facing systematic repression through incarceration and discrimination, xenophobia, according to their legal status. So, and also documentation, which represents a bigger risk of suffering violations. We highlighted in this event Haitians and people of African descent that asked for reparations for their situations specifically in Chile and the Dominican Republic. For quilombola communities in Brazil and Maroon societies in Honduras, for instance, security and safety relate to standing on their land and the territory where they were raised and continuing to eat what they cultivate, maintaining their religious practices, and having their lands titled by the government. I'm sorry about the background noise. Once again, many statements mention that the need to strengthen anti-racism organizations and social movements in order to give affected communities agency regarding their own reality is something we must do. Also in 2023, so last year, UNARC organized the logistical aspects of UN hearings in Brazil and the United States, where we heard from relatives of Black people who were tortured, violated, incarcerated, and discriminated against by law enforcement institutions. And one of the many statements that stood out with me and I would like to share was when a mother from Rio de Janeiro who lost her daughter and unborn grandchild during a police raid in a favela stated that she does not want to be a Black woman warrior, as people say as a compliment usually, because she did not register in the military, basically. So what she wanted was access to a dignified life for her family, which she's lost. Particularly in the Brazilian context, it is important to highlight that Brazil has the largest Black population outside of the African continent, more than 110 million people. However, this population has not been allowed to experience full citizenship because of systemic racism. The lack of control over the possession and sale of firearms, combined with the encouragement of far-right parliamentarians for the civilian population to take up arms during Bolsonaro's government, worsened Black population vulnerability here and has led to an increase in all forms of violence in the country. So the profile of the police brutality victims here is the same always, Black people. In 2022, Brazilian police forces were responsible for 6,429 deaths, and 83% of these were Black people. Along with this pain, revolt, hopelessness that we witnessed during the Emler visit to Brazil, during these side events, it is evident that the international arena and grassroots organizations have been benefiting with conjoint work, as it was clear with mechanisms such as Emler that heard more than 230 statements only in Brazil and the US. And these hearings allowed us to see the strength, the resilience, and a certain level of renewal on the voices and faces of people who are not used to having their voice heard. So the remaining feeling was bittersweet between a lot of pain and the continuous resistance of Black people, not because we want to be warriors, as the mother said, but because resistance is the only option. Last, I would like to highlight very quickly, because of time, that Emler is up to renewal. So on this session of the Human Rights Council, the 56th session, which will happen between 18 June and 12 July, so it started yesterday, you can share, like we are in this advocacy work around Emler's renewal, and you can share UNARC's letter to all states asking for Emler renewal. I can share the link now or afterwards, but I just wanted to let you know that this is happening right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nayara. And yes, pass me the link and we can share it on the chat. I know sometimes that can be a bit tricky, but thank you so much for opening that for us and giving us sort of the language to begin this conversation. I think what UNARC does is really key and unique in kind of how you are part of those a bit two worlds. Sometimes it feels like the international with bodies like the human rights. And in working with community voices. So thank you for that. I want to now turn to our panelists. So the way we are thinking of structuring this is each one of them will have 5 minutes to talk a little bit more about a specific article that we have in the collection, giving us a little bit more context from their perspective. And then we're going to have an interactive dialogue. And so the first person that we'll have speak is Georgina Orellano. Georgina Orellano is a street prostitute, a feminist, and an activist for the rights of Argentine sex workers. She has been the National Secretary General of the Sex Workers Union of Argentina, AMAR, since March 2014, and she is the author of the book Puta Feminista, Historias de una Trabajadora Sexual, that came out in 2022. Her work focuses on combating stigma and violence against sex workers, promoting legal recognition and labor rights. She has gained national and international recognition for her dedication to social justice and human rights, and she was one of the co-authors for the article La Patria es la Otra. So Georgina, thank you so much for joining us. Bienvenida. La palabra es tuya.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Buenos días a todas, a todos y a todes. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación y también agradecer al Centro de Estudios Sociales y Legales del CELS por haber construido entre ambas organizaciones el artículo La Patria es la Otra, que es poder compartir las estrategias y los mecanismos de resolución de conflictos que construimos las trabajadoras y los trabajadores sexuales, justamente porque no solo que tenemos una desconfianza hacia el derecho penal, sino que las veces que el derecho penal ha intervenido en la vida nuestra ha sido justamente para criminalizarnos, perseguirnos, detenernos de manera arbitraria, procesarnos y atravesar procesos judiciales con mucho estigma hacia nuestro trabajo. Así que producto de ello es que nosotras tenemos una desconfianza permanente hacia el sistema judicial o el derecho penal, y una desconfianza, incluso algunas se traslada esta desconfianza a algunas instituciones estatales. Entonces es muy difícil que para nosotras, cuando se presenta algún conflicto en nuestro trabajo, en nuestra vida cotidiana, querramos poder recurrir a alguna oficina estatal para poder solicitar su intervención, su solución o simplemente no su escucha. Sobre todo porque AMAR, como bien dijo Laura al principio, es una organización de trabajadoras y trabajadores sexuales que nace hace ya 29 años como una respuesta a la represión policial. La organización nace como una respuesta a la represión policial. Sus primeras asambleas, sus primeros encuentros entre compañeras que ejercían trabajo sexual en el espacio público, en la calle, fue en los calabozos. Fue ese lugar en las comisarías donde se encontraban de manera cotidiana, sin siquiera poder entender por qué el destino de una trabajadora sexual era justamente lidiar constantemente con ese atropello y con ese hostigamiento y acoso permanente por parte de las fuerzas de seguridad. También decirles que a nosotras, cuando pensamos estas estrategias y mecanismos conocidos como mediaciones o mesas de conciliación, fue en el marco, ¿no?, de la pandemia, que ha sido un contexto social y político y económico que hemos atravesado con muchas dificultades. Entonces, la primera dificultad que teníamos ahí era poder respetar las normativas de la cuarentena, los protocolos sanitarios que llevan adelante los gobiernos, en este caso el gobierno argentino, ¿no?, que era no salir de tu casa, y entender que ese no salir de tu casa para nosotras nos ponía ya en un problema, porque era no saber cómo íbamos a poder sostener las economías de nuestra familia, cómo pagar nuestros alquileres en nuestras viviendas, Así que el primer problema que... ¿Sigo?
Sí, sí. Creo que era la
Sí.
interpretación que por alguna razón, the interpretation for some reason cut in. Um,
Bueno,
vamos de vuelta.
sí, y, y el primer, digamos, el conflicto que teníamos era, primero, que muchas compañeras no podían respetar esos protocolos sanitarios dispuestos por el Estado nacional, justamente porque no tenían cómo poder sostener sus economías, así que iban a ejercer trabajo sexual de igual manera, y ahí se encontraban con una respuesta de control, no solamente policial, sino con un control social. Las primeras personas que denunciaban que ellas estaban incumpliendo el protocolo sanitario eran vecinos y vecinas, llamando a la policía, y la policía lo que hacía era detenerlas de manera arbitraria, procesarlas por incumplimiento de un decreto presidencial, pero no había un acompañamiento hacia esa situación puntual de vulnerabilidad económica, alimentaria o habitacional que esas compañeras presentaban. Así que fue a partir de una situación puntual de dos trabajadoras sexuales trans migrantes que se encontraron, ambas atravesadas por la misma situación de vulnerabilidad y falta de políticas públicas, se encontraron en la esquina, pelearon por su zona, porque una prácticamente para la otra resultaba como una persona nueva, y dentro de nuestro trabajo, aunque no sea reconocido estatalmente, no tenga un reconocimiento laboral, sí hay una organización del trabajo en sí, digamos, frente a la precariedad, la violencia institucional y la falta de derechos. Lo que sí hay una organización del trabajo eh, que tiene que ver con establecer los horarios, por ejemplo, establecer las zonas de trabajo, las esquinas, ciertos acuerdos de respeto justamente para poder desarrollar el trabajo sexual con un respeto no solamente hacia otras compañeras, sino también para no tener conflictos en el barrio específico donde se está desarrollando el trabajo sexual. Y sobre todo estos acuerdos nacen también como un cuidado entre trabajadoras sexuales eh, para enfrentar el hostigamiento y el acoso permanente de las fuerzas de seguridad. Así que las dos compañeras que tuvieron este conflicto se vieron afectadas, primero porque la primera intervención que hubo fue filmar con un teléfono celular esa pelea callejera y subirla a las redes sociales. Ese video se viralizó en muchos grupos y tanto o sea, la construcción social siempre busca, ¿no?, que haya una víctima y una victimaria, y la construcción de una sola verdad, cuando nadie sabía que ambas compañeras estaban atravesadas por la misma vulnerabilidad, no pudiendo cumplir eh, el protocolo sanitario, teniendo deudas en los lugares donde vivían, siendo migrantes y no pudiendo tener regularizada su situación migratoria en el país, requisito que le impedía poder acceder a algunos programas sociales, por ejemplo. Así que se vieron afectadas ambas con la viralización de ese video. Una que recibió todo el descargo del odio y tuvo que cerrar sus redes sociales porque incluso recibió amenazas. La otra que se vio expuesta de ese modo y atravesando ese proceso con un montón de angustia al verse reflejada en ese video y en las redes sociales, y sobre todo porque su familia, ambas eran de Perú, son de Perú, su familia se enteraron, incluso se enteraron que ejercían trabajo sexual, eh, no teniendo ellas la posibilidad y la oportunidad de poder decírselo ellas, o poder ellas elegir ser visibles y reconocerse públicamente como trabajadoras sexuales. Así que lo primero que esperamos ahí fue que se calme un poco ese clamor social de las redes sociales que buscaban sí o sí aniquilar a una y revictimizar a otra, las juntamos a ambas, le pedimos una reunión en el sindicato con la presencia de algunas delegadas y por supuesto del equipo de abogados de la organización. Y lo primero que activamos ahí es el dispositivo de la escucha, de escuchar qué era lo que había pasado, por qué se había llegado a la situación límite de ejercer la violencia. Ambas reconocieron que para ellas la violencia era su única herramienta de defensa en el territorio, que no era la primera vez que se encontraban frente a una situación de conflicto con otra compañera y mediara la violencia. Reconocían que esa era la única forma, inclusive, que tenían como modo de resolver los conflictos que atravesaban de manera cotidiana, no solo en el trabajo sexual, sino también en su vida cotidiana, en los hoteles donde vivían, cuando sufrían discriminación en el espacio público. Bueno, cuando se tuvieron ambas que ir de su casa, irse de su país, también fue una decisión atravesada por situaciones de violencia y conflictos permanentes que decidieron su desplazamiento hacia Argentina. Así que lo primero fue la escucha y después preguntarle a las dos de qué manera ellas creían que el sindicato o la organización podía dar una intervención que favorezca a las dos y que no castigue a una y proteja a la otra, entendiendo que ambas tenían muchas situaciones que las representaban y bueno, muchas coincidencias, ¿no? Incluso en sus modos de vida, en sus modos de organización del trabajo sexual. Eh, Ninguna de las dos pidió el castigo entre ellas. No pidieron ni el castigo, ni el escrache, ni la expulsión del espacio público. Eh, la más afectada, por así decirlo, lo que pidió fue disculpas y sí ambas coincidieron en que querían que la organización pudiera intervenir para dar de baja el video que estaba subido en las redes sociales. Ambas querían que ese video sea eliminado. Y después sí, a partir de ahí, eh, todos esos acuerdos se firmó en un libro de actas que tenemos en la organización. A partir de ahí hicimos público que esas compañeras que habían sido viralizadas por tal video se habían acercado a la organización, que habíamos encontrado una alternativa de solución, que no sea el castigo ni la cancelación, que ambas estaban muy angustiadas por el nivel de exposición. Contamos un poco de la situación de vulnerabilidad que ambas atravesaban y pedíamos que a quienes habían difundido los videos, por favor, que los bajasen porque estaban de acuerdo las dos compañeras, o sea, las dos partes, en que lejos de dar una buena intervención, ese video lo único que aportó fue más violencia y revictimización en la vida de cada una de ellas. Y después nos encontramos con esas mediaciones en donde llega de todo y no siempre se solucionan los problemas de las compañeras, ¿no? Porque también fue como prueba y error, o sea, entender que no todos los conflictos son iguales y no todos los conflictos se van a resolver mediante la misma intervención, en este caso, de la organización. Siempre los conflictos que llegan son los que aparecen en el espacio público, que tienen que ver con situaciones específicas del trabajo, rompimiento de acuerdos, pero después también nos aparecía mucho otro tipo de conflictos que se da ya no en el espacio de trabajo, sino en el espacio donde viven las compañeras, que suelen ser hoteles, pensiones, inquilinatos, y ahí hay otro tipo de conflictos que aparecen, como por ejemplo préstamos de dinero,
Cristina,
o sea, nosotras no
¿puedo pedir
tenemos una política, sí,
de
y
hacer
ahí
un
ya
minuto
cierro,
más? Sí,
sí.
buenísimo. Muchas gracias.
Digamos, no tenemos una política de ahorro más que esta, ¿no? De acceder a dinero de manera precaria, con préstamos, con acuerdos de palabra, entonces también había como préstamos de dinero, circulación de dinero y deudas, endeudamiento, que aparejaba un conflicto donde ahí ya lo que estaba en riesgo era la vivienda de las compañeras, porque cuando aparecía ese conflicto en el lugar donde vivían, ya había otra persona interviniendo que básicamente son los dueños de esos hoteles, que cuando aparece un conflicto entre trabajadoras sexuales, lo primero que lo resuelve es echándola a ambas personas, ¿no? Diciéndole, bueno, dándole, algunas veces te dan un margen de días para que consigas otro lugar, o si no, a veces en el momento. Así que ahí la intervención de la organización tenía que ver con primero ir a sensibilizar al dueño de ese hotel para después sentarnos con las compañeras. Pero bueno, para nosotras los mecanismos de mediación lo que construyó fue una estrategia comunitaria de pensar que las comunidades podemos tener alternativas al derecho penal, sobre todo cuando desconfiamos del derecho penal y cuando las veces que el derecho penal ha intervenido en la vida nuestra, fue para criminalizarnos, ¿no? Y hacernos siempre la pregunta, ¿por qué siempre tenemos como ese chip puesto de que la policía es un ente de confianza? ¿No? Porque aunque hemos sido criminalizadas, hemos sido detenidas, siempre cuando aparece un conflicto en tu vida, lo primero que hacemos es llamar a la policía. ¿Y por qué está el deseo del castigo hacia el otro? ¿No? En el momento de lo que me está pasando el conflicto está el deseo de castigar al otro, pero después pasan días y ya una va pensando, digamos, desde otro lugar. Entonces, encontrar esto, encontrar otras alternativas que no sean el castigo, que sean alternativas mucho más colectivas y sobre todo que sean comunitarias y que apelen más a la escucha y no al señalamiento.
Wonderful. Thank you, Georgina, so much for that. And I think there are many things to grab onto that. I'm struck by how long the work has been, but also how much there is to learn about recent crises like the pandemic, that circumstance, that difficult experience led to working on these alternatives. And I was also struck on that that idea of that chip that we go immediately for punishment, and what that does is, as you said, create these binaries of victim and victimizer rather than recognizing this mutual vulnerability. So thank you so much for your presentation, and we'll come back with questions in a little bit. I want to turn to Nick Espia for our next presentation. Nick is an Aboriginal man from the Arrernte Nation in Central Australia. Nick is a lawyer and a social justice advocate with decades of experience in legal practice and Aboriginal justice policy. He has worked in various management positions across the Northern Territory and the Kimberley region in Australia. In recent years, Nick managed a NEAAJA peacemaking project that brought together Aboriginal peacemakers from across remote regions in Northern Australia with a focus on reducing community conflict and interactions with the criminal justice system. Nick was part of a group of co-writers that put together the article Standing in the Middle, and we are so glad to have him, especially since it's crazy late for him. So very grateful for him to join us. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. So the focus of what I'm wanting to talk about and the title of Standing in the Middle is a phrase used by the Groote Eylandt peacemakers. Groote Eylandt is in Northern Territory or Northern Australia. It's an island, or it's a group of islands referred to as the Groote Eylandt Archipelago, which is the traditional lands of the Anandiyakwa people. For a number of years, in recent years, the Anandiyakwa people in about 3 communities on those islands, those communities, Ambakamba, Anurugu and Milyakbara. There had been a number of deaths that arose out of community conflict in those Aboriginal communities. These are communities, like many other communities across the Northern Territory, that have a number of problems that often lead to interactions with police, which are often negative interactions. Many of the things that cause community conflict include dispossession, include of land, include people being brought together from across different regions and brought together in small communities, which has happened over the last 2 centuries across Australia, particularly in relation to Groote Eylandt. It happened as a result of Christian missionaries and also mining taking place on that island. So essentially, after a number of deaths that had occurred because of community violence and conflict, a number of community members were thinking about ways forward. Their concern was that, particularly in the probably the last death that caused the conversation around what they could do, was discussing the fact that the small number of police attended a large conflict, and all they could do, which is what they often would do, is sit back away from the violence and simply record what was going on, and didn't actually try and stop what was going on. To some extent, the community members' view is also that police aren't the best people to intervene, and that often only makes things worse. So together, a number of community members worked with an anthropologist that lived on the island, that they sought out some training in mediation and combined traditional forms of peacemaking and conflict resolution with more modern Western version of mediation, and then commenced intervening in disputes, often intervening in lower level disputes, which were often the catalyst for larger conflicts and violence in their communities. This fast forwarding to the current time, over the past few years, their work across their communities has reduced conflict, has reduced violence, but more importantly, has reduced interactions with the police to a significant percentage. Beyond the peacemakers' work on Groote Eylandt, and more broadly in the Northern Territory and in Australia, thankfully we don't perhaps see as many police-related deaths as in some other countries that people are joining us here. However, over 30 years ago, we had a royal commission, an inquiry into deaths in custody of Aboriginal people who were disproportionately affected. In 30 years since the recommendations of that Royal Commission report, there's been more than 500 deaths relating to Aboriginal people in custody. And a recent death that happened in 2019 was the death of a young man from the Warlpiri community, which is an Aboriginal community of Yuendamu in the desert region, the Tanami Desert region of the Northern Territory. Kumanjai is a name or a term that referred to that's substituted for the name of a deceased person. It's a word that's used in Warlpiri language as well as the Aranda language, which is the language of my family. It's a word used to talk about someone that's passed away. Talking about someone that's died is culturally has complications and is not something that's often done following someone's death. However, now almost 5 years since Kumanjai Walker has passed away, a coronial inquest into his death is ongoing. Evidence has only just completed about 3 or 4 weeks ago. However, the inquest will be ongoing probably until about this time next year. So to put that into context, this paper and this conversation we're having, as Laura said at the start, arose out of conversations following the death of George Floyd, the death that I'm referring to here in the Northern Territory of Australia was 6 months earlier than that in 2019. It was the result of a policeman shooting this young 19-year-old man in a failed arrest in his home community. one officer was charged with murder and then subsequently acquitted of that murder. The coronial inquest commenced in about May 2022, and as I said, is ongoing. How that relates to the peacemakers on Groote Eylandt is as follows. Following that death, the peacemakers from Groote Eylandt had been travelling to a number of communities, sharing their learnings, sharing their successes in creating peace. They'd travelled to some coastal communities that were nearby to them. They had also, following this death in Yuendamu, had travelled to that community where Kumanjayi Walker had been killed and had met with a number of community leaders and community elders in that community to share their knowledge and skills and help them to possibly think about how they could also use those peacemaking skills to resolve conflict in their community, which is something that they were also familiar with. NAJA, which is the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, which is a legal aid service in the Northern Territory that represents Aboriginal people, together with the Human Rights Law Centre, had appeared or sought leave to the Coronial Court to appear in this inquest that started in 2022. One thing we had looked at, in addition to scrutinising the government and scrutinising the actions of police, was to highlight community solutions. One of those solutions that we wanted to highlight was the work of the Groote Eylandt peacemakers as a positive example of alternatives to traditional policing, and a community-led process that successfully worked towards addressing community safety concerns in that community and the need for those sort of programs in communities, including Yuendamu and others. So with the assistance of a number of the peacemakers, they had provided evidence, written evidence in this inquest to share the story of their work to this coronial inquest, in order to provide these sort of alternatives. Following that, we had a conversation with the group peacemakers about sharing their stories more broadly, and then they've assisted us in using that same information to write this paper. So another thing that was happening parallel to this inquest, and also inspired by the work of the Groote Eylandt peacemakers, and also the similar needs of many other community members, was working with NAJA on a project that I had worked on to bring together peacemaking and mediation skills to many other remote Aboriginal communities. And in Northern Territory, we have communities spread over vast remote regions across the Northern Territory. So together with including the Groote Eylandt peacemakers, we had brought together about 7 communities over a couple of years, providing training, enhancing their own forms of traditional conflict resolution, and sharing knowledge and networking and bringing those people together to discuss strategies to address community conflict and crime in their communities. Because of one of the sort of underlying or constant things across all those communities is that police interactions are often negative. They often lead to excessive use of force and violence by police, and they lead to more Aboriginal people being in prison, which is a huge issue in the Northern Territory and more broadly in Australia.
Can I ask you for one more minute, Nick? If that's good?
Yep. So I guess just broadly, as I said, we will be making submissions in this inquest around the idea of the traditional form of policing is not really effective, and that what we would be recommending is government supports a lot of these grassroots community initiatives, and rather than the traditional policing, focus on a multidisciplinary approach to community safety through government supporting and working collaboratively with people like the Good Island Peacemakers and others who often do this work either self-funded or without any government funding or assistance. But yeah, that's probably a good place to stop. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. And yeah, the Standing in the Middle article, I think is a wonderful one for folks to go and read. I think it's having this sort of like positive example that already has proven to have a positive impact in terms of numbers of violence, is a really hopeful one, and then once again brings to the table that even if one would like to look into police interventions from just an effectiveness perspective, it is not effective in that many times it will lead from, lower level disputes. It will just amplify that, and we end up in a lot more serious situations, a lot of tragic events, and as you mentioned, the over incarceration of certain communities. And once again, kind of bringing back, that reminds me of how, I mean, George Floyd might be a name that we all recognize, but there are hundreds, not only in the United States, but elsewhere, that we might not know their names as well. So thank you, Nick, for that. I'll turn to our last panelist, last but not least. Cheryl Das is one of the two co-editors that I worked with on this project. So she knows the ins and outs of the whole collection. She is a practicing legal practitioner admitted in the High Court of South Africa. She is the current regional director of the Legal Resource Center based in Cape Town. And her previous roles include managing attorney of Harris, Nupin, Molebatsi, Inc., where she practiced philanthropy law. And she's also been a senior attorney at the Equal Education Law Center, where she managed the Refugee and Migrant Rights Program in Durban at Lawyers for Human Rights. So Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lara. I hope that everybody can hear me, because I'm actually using two devices. So you can see me on my laptop, but you can hear me hopefully on my cell phone, because we're having some internet problems at the office. So technology, guys. So just thumbs up, Laura, if you can hear me clearly. Great. Okay, so moving on swiftly from my internet fails and struggles, I want to talk about the South African article, which really focuses on policing in the context of housing and evictions. This article was co-authored by the LRC and a social movement called the Housing Assembly, and it speaks to the plight of homeless people and their experiences with the police in their efforts to advocate for housing rights and protections against evictions. I think the article rightly points out that the journey for decent housing for predominantly Black people in South Africa must be understood within the context of British colonialism and apartheid. And I think what is particularly interesting there is around the dehumanization and stigmatizations of Black people during the apartheid era. I want to start really by making this statement that the police is a state apparatus, and they neither protect nor serve the people of South Africa. And it was a state apparatus during apartheid and continues to be such in democracy. Their main function as a state apparatus during apartheid was to control and prevent an insurgency from the Black majority and people of color generally, but also to enforce apartheid laws and policies. The dehumanizing and stigmatization of Black and brown people legitimized violent and brutal attacks by the police against people of color. It was easier to justify killing, torturing, evicting, demoralizing Black and brown people if their lives and dignity were considered inferior to that of the white Afrikaner people. There was a common term used to conjure up fear amongst white South Africans. It was called the swart gevaar, meaning Black danger. So people were depicted as dangerous criminals, not human beings. Apartheid laws and policies mirrored this othering of Black people in South Africa. Black people, for example, could not own property or land. With the passing of the Group Areas Act, Black people were violently removed from their homes. Their homes were summarily demolished and their dignity was stripped. I remember litigating a case around the recent evictions. And one of the things, when we researched was on the 10th of June, in this particular case, on the 10th of June, 1976, the Prevention of Illegal Squatting Amendment Bill was tabled in the apartheid-era House of Assembly. The amendment bill was introduced this new provision that authorized local authorities and landowners to summarily demolish without a court order any building or structure that was erected on land without consent. So this was white-owned land or state-owned land, and this gave them carte blanche to remove and destroy the homes of Black individuals and remove the materials from their land. So 4 decades later, some members of the Housing Assembly were violently evicted by an armed municipal police officials at the Entembeni informal settlement in Khayelitsha in Cape Town. An occupant in that settlement was forcibly dragged out of his shack while he was taking a bath. And law enforcement officials proceeded to tear down and demolish his home using crowbars and other implements. These scenes were starkly reminiscent of apartheid-era evictions, and on grounds similar to those advanced by that apartheid government to justify demolishing homes of Black people without a court order. So in this context, and the article speaks to this, police officials had no business being there. They are not empowered under law to effect evictions with or without a court order. Only a sheriff of the court under a warrant can evict. Yet the police were there, and they actively participated in the eviction. The reasons for their presence in the court papers filed later was that they were there to protect city officials in case that community resisted eviction. This justification for police presence is commonplace during large-scale evictions in Black townships in South Africa. The assumption, therefore, was that this community of Black and brown people were dangerous and could be violent. This article addresses that type of institutionalized racism within policing structures and how Black people experience over-policing and violent oppression despite progressive laws in our country to date. The article does propose alternatives to a certain extent in response to conflict around basic social needs. It acknowledges that some reforms post-apartheid have been introduced, such as community-based policing, but these initiatives have never been successful. They have many criticisms and have largely failed. True reform needs to address the structural and institutionalized racism within the police service, which must also address or redress the dehumanizing of Black people through education and training. Without a complete paradigm shift in how Black and brown people are perceived as dangerous and as violent, any intervention, human rights training, etc., will be very cosmetic in nature. My understanding of the article as a whole is a call to acknowledge institutionalized racism brought or fathered through colonialism and apartheid within the police force, and calls to decolonize the police. I would just want to end around how this article could possibly, reflect outside the borders of South Africa, and particular communities outside of South Africa. I think it was a privilege for me to co-edit the entire compendium of In Our Hands, because I think that the common theme throughout the compendium was the dehumanizing and stigmatization of groups of people based on their race, nationality, gender, or social class. Like the Housing Assembly, most of the authors in this compendium has lost faith and trust in the police. And unless we address the harmful narratives that follow people that have been historically marginalized by colonialism and apartheid, we would only be plastering over the root causes of police repression. Thanks, Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I think that kind of encompasses so much of what we've seen in these articles and how that ties to the specific case around housing rights in South Africa. So thank you for pulling that together. I want to encourage folks to ask questions if you have regarding the initiatives that have been spoken, and rather than kind of the diagnosis that we've gone over. But I wanted to start this up by asking a question to Nayara. And so not too long ago, recently, I read an article in The Guardian that claimed that the Black Lives Matter era has ended. And it struck me. I struggled with that. So I wanted to ask you what you think. Do you think that the global community's attention has moved on kind of from the radical or transformative demands that they were making? What does that mean for activists that were working on this way before, the Black Lives Matter movement, and will have to continue? So just wanted to hear your reactions to that.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me well? Okay, perfect. Well, I read the article, and it is a quite important article and discussion that the author brings. And to start, when she started discussing the success of the movement, of Black Lives Matter movement, through its most high-profile adoptions, the author mentions that bringing more people of color into pre-existing structures is far too narrow a route to systemic racial equalization. So this means, and I agree with that it's not fair to the Black Lives Matter movement or any anti-racist movement worldwide to reduce its impact by reinforcing only the optics of like big companies that highlight diversity and inclusion in the workplace, only if that is what the market require at the moment, or even by the optics of the average ally or so-called ally that believed that by posting social media a Black background picture, in Instagram with a Black Lives Matter hashtag in 2020, they were meaningfully contributing to the anti-racism fight. So in my perception, all of this is indeed too narrow a route to racial equity. And more than that, civil society organizations, especially the Black social movements, have denounced the violence that Black people suffers to international human rights mechanisms, bodies, and the UN, and demanded that the states take effective measures to ensure that full citizenship reaches the majority. This has been going on since the start. So since the root causes, as I mentioned, the colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade of enslaved Africans. So these communities have been resisting the Eurocentric patterns, racial profiling,
scientific racism, which even though scientifically proven wrong, is still used as a weapon to violate Black bodies and minorities, such as Black mothers who have the highest maternal death rates. And we need to remember that for as long as there is racism, there is resistance from Black communities. A great example, as I mentioned previously, are the Quilombola communities and the Maroon societies in the region, in Latin America and Caribbean, but also elsewhere. So absolutely nothing changed for people on the ground that has been fighting for their rights nationally, regionally, and with international mechanisms. The activism is pretty much alive. So yes, Black Lives Matter is still here, even though we are not, like, only if we are not considering this high profile vision or optics of what this movement was and is.
Thank you, Nayada. Nick, I want to turn to you. And something that has kind of come up a number of times is kind of that automatic, almost knee-jerk reaction that thinks that police is the best placed to intervene when there's a conflict. And I want to hear from you as to why, not only that misses the mark, but that tends to lead to hurt those that have historically bear the brunt of kind of state and police intervention. And maybe a second part to that question, we have a question from the audience regarding if any of the panelists know of government initiatives that have worked to sort of like unroot systematic discrimination that's part of law enforcement, which I think is a bit at the root of that. So if maybe you can reflect on those two questions.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge we have in Australia more broadly, but also particularly here in the Northern Territory, is getting police or getting governments to admit that racism is a problem in their services. It's something that was quite significantly highlighted and exposed in the Kumanjai Walker inquest that I referred to, where was many examples of both overt and systemic racism and the interactions between those attitudes and the way police deal with Aboriginal people in this country. It seems that the accusation of racism seems to be worse than the recipient of racism. You in this country, you just can't, probably like others, accusing someone or an agency of racism is throws up people being very defensive and throws denials. And in fact, what we exposed last month in this inquest was the fact that our police commissioner essentially denied knowledge of ongoing and as well as historic examples of both systemic racism as well as this overt racism. And in fact, we had there was uncovered police having end of year awards that used racist posters and racist names as awards for people within their team. So we're advocating both through this inquest and more broadly through other avenues that particularly our police force needs to address racism, needs an anti-racism strategy, trying to find a police department in this country, in other jurisdictions, that's taken ownership and done that is difficult. So for us, I guess it's trying to get them to accept, and in fact to understand that racism is not just the overt and obvious racism, it's the structural and systemic ways that attitudes, policies and procedures have a detrimental effect to our people, our Aboriginal people in this country and their interactions with police. I think we're still on that journey of understanding those concepts, and sadly it has to be sort of learnt through, the process of someone dying. But yes, going back to the first part of that question, Laura, it is the knee-jerk reaction here that police are the only solution. We have police commissioners and ministers talking about social problems, high rates of crime, etc. And whilst they'll get up in front of the media and say, well, we can't arrest our way out of the problem, the only funding to a problem is more funding for more of the same type of policing. The only law reform is often more detrimental, more oppressive, and providing police with more powers. Certainly what the narrative we're trying to get across is that the solutions aren't just the people with the blue uniforms. The solution to community safety and reducing dysfunction, conflict and crime in communities, it does take that collaborative approach of police working with others in the communities. The peacemakers is a good example. Other examples in our Aboriginal communities include community safety patrols, or night patrols as they're often called, who are again people that are working to be the intervening, to get there before the police and diffuse things and get people home or get people to safety, or diffuse conflict. We have over 100 languages spoken in Northern Territory, 100 Aboriginal languages, and many different and diverse Aboriginal cultures. So cultural etiquette, interactions with people in their own, through their own cultural way, being culturally responsive, often means being more effective. There's a lot that's lost in a predominantly non-Aboriginal or white police force interacting with our people, and those officers coming from very different cultural backgrounds, having the language barriers, not understanding cultural differences, whereas you have people like the peacemakers, or the sort of a more culturally appropriate way of interacting with people, whether that's diffusing a situation, whether that's having to arrest someone, is someone speaking to them in their own language, is acknowledgement of the extensive family networks and different family structures that include people in their own communities having, some people having cultural authority in relation to others, and that mutual respect that goes with it. So utilising the strengths of Aboriginal culture is definitely a solution, and a more effective one, rather than just relying on more of the same, which is police, being reactive, if that answers the question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, that's really great. I have two questions that are coming from the audience, but before I turn to those, Georgina, I have a question for you, which is regarding, I think one thing that struck me about the example in Amar is how there isn't sort of a script or a preset list of steps of what needs to be done, but that it's kind of a dialogue. And it seems to me that it's kind of an open process to see what the people in conflict need. And I'm wondering why, to you, it's important to have that flexible and open approach, and how that has been, developed, or yeah, your thoughts on that. Great. I think maybe someone might have some sound open. No? Okay. Georgina, all yours.
Ahí. Bueno, primero decirles que para nosotros la escucha es muy importante en cada intervención conocida como la mediación o reuniones de conciliación. Primero porque somos un colectivo que muy pocas veces logramos ser escuchadas por el Estado, por ciertos sectores de la sociedad, por algunos sectores del feminismo, por algunos sectores de la sociedad civil, y sobre todo porque nos ha costado mucho poder hablar en primera persona por el estigma, por los prejuicios, por la vergüenza, que muchas veces es lo primero que sentimos cuando ejercemos el trabajo sexual, y tener que andar dando explicaciones de manera continua por qué decidimos ejercer este trabajo y no otro. Y siempre cuando las trabajadoras sexuales queremos intentar hablar, siempre tenemos que andar justificando nuestro trabajo, justificando nuestra decisión y generando argumentos incluso teóricos y técnicos para dejar al otro o a la otra como contento o contenta eh, por nuestra decisión. Pero muy pocas veces en las intervenciones que hemos tenido con algunos actores políticos y sociales, nos han dejado que podamos hablar de lo que nosotras verdaderamente queremos contarles. Siempre estamos como respondiendo a sus preguntas, respondiendo a ciertos debates que por ahí no son los debates que nosotras nos damos hacia el interior de nuestra organización, y respondiendo a otras urgencias de otras personas que no suelen ser problemas centrales y estructurales que tenemos nosotras en nuestras vidas. Por eso decimos que cuando formamos la organización y todos los espacios que tenemos en AMAR, han resultado de manera positiva, porque las trabajadoras sexuales sentimos que tenemos un lugar propio, un lugar donde nosotras definimos qué hacer y no un lugar donde nos imponen qué tenemos que hacer, y un lugar donde definimos entre todas qué tipo de asistencia queremos las trabajadoras sexuales. Y necesitamos, sobre todo, cuando atravesamos situaciones, bueno, de conflictos, o también, bueno, el incremento de la violencia institucional, por ejemplo, en este contexto donde nos gobierna Milei, que hemos tenido nuevamente que apelar a otras estrategias comunitarias porque empezaron a aparecer situaciones en el territorio que no pasaban hace 20 años. Entonces, como que ahí también hubo un retroceso, y también hubo un retroceso en ir a ver qué hacían las compañeras en los años 90, en el inicio de la fundación de la organización, porque justamente lo que nos está pasando ahora es algo que pasó hace 20 años atrás, como el robo de dinero, las racias policiales, eh, mucha violencia por parte de la policía. Así que para nosotros la escucha es algo fundamental, sobre todo cuando somos un colectivo atravesado por el estigma social, y siempre hemos sido consideradas como sujetos de la peligrosidad. Entonces a la peligrosa no se la escucha, ya directamente se la condena. La peligrosa no trae una verdad con ella, trae un conflicto que hay que resolverlo, y muy pocas veces en esa resolución se tiene en cuenta el deseo nuestro, ¿no? Y eso es un poco lo que hacemos en AMAR. Eh, Siempre preguntamos todas las situaciones que aparecen, ya sea de violencia de género, ya sea una mediación por alimentos con una expareja, ya sea por un problema judicial que atraviesan las madres que son trabajadoras sexuales, ya sea por conflicto entre propias compañeras en el espacio público o un conflicto con un mediante desalojo. Siempre preguntamos de qué manera creen esas compañeras que confían en el sindicato, confían en la organización al traer y contar su problema, de qué manera creen que nosotras podemos intervenir y que esa intervención sea favorable. Y en la mayoría de las veces, vuelvo a ser reiterativa, pero eso para nosotras ha sido una enseñanza, que incluso en situaciones de separaciones violentas, con situaciones de violencia de género, nunca hubo un deseo de las trabajadoras sexuales de castigar al otro con la cárcel. Nunca hubo un deseo de decir, quiero al otro o a la otra que esté preso, porque bueno, nosotras sabemos lo que es estar detenidas, y sabemos que ahí no hay un modo de corrección hacia la persona, todo lo contrario. Hay modos donde la persona es aleccionada de una manera mucho más violenta, mucho más arbitraria, entonces no hay una reparación ahí. Con la cárcel no hay una reparación. Hay una demagogia punitiva, pero no hay una reparación en la persona, en un acto social, en un programa social. Así que eso, para nosotros la escucha, sobre todas las cosas, teniendo en cuenta que muy pocas veces encontramos lugares donde hubo una escucha activa y una escucha respetuosa. Siempre que fuimos a hablar, incluso a ventanilla del Estado, tuvimos que armarnos de paciencia y explicarle al otro o a la otra por qué ejercíamos el trabajo sexual. Y eso a veces nos lleva una hora explicarle.
Claro.
Explicarle al otro y terminar, ¿no?, respondiendo a un cuestionario con dudas que trae la otra persona, pero que no son dudas que tenemos nosotras, porque no hay duda en que el trabajo sexual para nosotras es nuestro trabajo, no hay duda en que no queremos cambiar de trabajo, queremos con mejores condiciones laborales, y no hay duda de que nosotras queremos derechos laborales y no alternativas, y que justamente muchas veces de las que hemos ido al Estado, eh, decidimos no volver porque siempre hay ahí, ¿no?, una idea asidua de querer rescatarnos, de querer darnos mejores oportunidades laborales, de mirarnos con lástima, con compasión, y que cuando nosotras reivindicamos nuestro trabajo, ya no nos miran con lástima y compasión, nos miran con dudas, no, nos miran como personas extrañas que como que hay una deslegitimidad de nuestra verdad. No todo el tiempo están deslegitimando nuestras narrativas, bueno, que no se ajustan a veces a categorías victimizantes con las que suelen intervenir desde el Estado hacia las personas que ejercemos trabajo sexual.
Gracias, Georgina. Yeah, I think I felt this with every single of the articles, but this one once again reminds me of how transferable many of these sort of lessons, and the lesson of the importance of listening and hearing felt to me really powerful, and made me think, even to the example you had about this video being shown. Nick mentioned also about a video, or of people recording conflict sometimes, and how these recordings don't allow someone to speak for themselves, or don't allow for the dialogue to go both ways, right? It goes only one way. And so I think that's really interesting. We are running a little bit over time, so I want to check with the panelists if you're okay to stay on for a minute or two, or how we're doing. Okay. There are two questions that I'm going to read and then open them up for whoever wants to take them. So one question from the audience is, how do we leverage or integrate international advocacy efforts to hold law enforcement organizations accountable domestically in our respective countries? I'm looking at you, Nayara and Cheryl, but whoever wants to take it. And then another question is, how do you feel that these articles help to conceptualize, to understand racism in a wider perspective that's not included to Afro communities, right? So even if the inspiration came regarding racial discrimination in policing to Afro communities, clearly we've opened it up to other experiences, and why would you think that's important? So I'll leave those two questions for whoever feels like taking them up. Nayara, go ahead.
Thank you. About the first question, so how to integrate international advocacy efforts to hold law enforcement organizations accountable nationally, domestically. A few examples that we have through our engagement with EMLR is when organizations have the opportunity to first access the tools available in the international organizations to understand how these tools can support them nationally. So one of the tools that we use at UNARC is basically HRC statements, so Human Rights Council statements. And from these statements, we had the opportunity to bring to highlight some cases, for instance, about xenophobia and racism against Haitians in Chile and also in the Dominican Republic. So last year, 2 of our organizations gave joint statements during HRC. And what we understand is that the UN, it's not that the UN will solve the issue or have, unfortunately, or have the ability to protect people on the ground. This is not what we believe in, because this is not what happens. The UN can help to amplify the voices and amplify the platform of advocacy from these organizations internationally. And then with the results, so for instance, with statements in the HRC, these groups can bring the statements and to the ground and push the governments. So in these 2 particular cases, what happened is, so in Chile, we gave this joint statement with the organization on the ground. And after that, a diplomat from Chile reached out to us and reached out to the organization, wanted to work in collaboration and have conversations to better support their engagement with the local government. In the case of the Dominican Republic, what happened is through this statement that we amplified, we sent to all of the state representatives, we publish in YouTube, other media, share with our partners, networks. So through this statement, New York Times reached out to the organization, wanted to tell their story. So they had an interview and they wrote an article about this situation. And with this article, they also brought the situation to the ground. So basically, I understand that this engagement is not so the international organization is going to solve the issue. No, it's just a way to amplify our work, to amplify our platforms, and then push the governments that unfortunately needs to be put into situation of being ashamed, to take some actions sometimes. So it's just a platform. International organizations are a platform to increase the work that are already being made on the ground by the real experts that are the activists, the people who are living the situation. I hope this answered.
That was great. Yes. Thank you, Naya. Any other takers for either this question or the question about including other experiences? I think Cheryl, Nick, did you unmute as well?
Yeah, I did. I suppose just trying to answer that quickly, and perhaps it sort of answers both questions, but particularly, reflecting on how papers such as this might help, I guess, similar to what Nayada said about, amplifying voices. I think that's an important thing, that it's an opportunity to amplify the voices that, for us here in this country to be able to, talk to government and say, hey, the work that these people are doing on this tiny little island off the coast of the continent, people are listening to that story internationally. Hopefully that helps maybe guilt them or shame them into taking a bit more notice and actually providing funding and resourcing for some of the community-led solutions that we've talked about. I think that's all you can do in the sense of finding other avenues and opportunities to amplify voices. But similarly, I guess for us here, it's ironic that I think the mainstream media or public are more likely to sympathise with examples of police brutality or racism in other countries, such as the US, and maybe because we watch too much of your television, but they're more likely to accept that as a problem rather than looking in our own backyard and acknowledging what's going wrong here in this country. So I think opportunities to share these stories and link them up and hopefully get people in their own countries to either take note of some of the positive examples that people are doing elsewhere, or at least acknowledge, hey, if they're talking about this problem, if they're listening in, South Africa, if they're listening in the US or Brazil, well, maybe we better listen to our own people as well. So I guess that's just a basic comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And I understand if you have to head out, it's like past 11 p.m. over there. So thank you so much for the time and for staying up. Cheryl, I think you had your hand up, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, really quick. I agree with Niara and Nick. I mean, I agree exactly. It's about amplifying voices. I think that what we can, and from the experience of co-editing this compendium and looking at the various articles and what are the commonalities, I think it's around, you know, growing inequalities and dominant cultural narratives that entrench those inequalities. And I think we can use that as an example of how we can actually use that in a wider perspective, as Julia said. So I want to leave it there in the interest of time. I do have lots of opinions, very opinionated, but thank you very much for putting this together. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Georgina, any last thoughts before we close? I just want to open that. No, okay, wonderful. Well, then I want to thank so much each and every one of our panelists. I want to thank our interpreters that made this event more accessible. I want to reiterate that we have some already brilliant and thought-provoking articles on in our hands in the website. Some of them are translated, many of them are translated, and we have new ones coming up from Ireland, Indonesia, 2 more from Argentina, and further ones. So please either subscribe to Inclo, follow on Twitter so that you know it. But even more important, look up the writers of these articles and their organizations and the work that they are doing, because it is amazing. And especially at times right now that are really difficult times, they are inspiring and they are hopeful, and that has been my experience. I hope that can be yours as well. So thank you, everyone, and I hope everyone has a good and safe rest of your day.